Hello, I'm Professor Alice Roberts. Welcome to the Free University of Glastonbury. We are not in the usual tent in the usual field this year, but we are still here. And this year I'm co-presenting with my very good friend, the art historian, Dr. Janina Ramirez. And together we're going to do a bit of toing and froing and look at some art objects and pass each object on to one another and try to unpack what they mean and look into the history of our own species, but also the history of art at the same time. So I'm going to start with possibly the oldest artistic object. I think it is the oldest artistic object in the world. It was discovered on the island of Java in the 19th century by a doctor and anatomist called Eugène Dubois. Now, he was fascinated with human origins, where we'd come from as a species, and he decided that fossils might be the important clues to help us understand our own evolution. And he also thought that humans might have evolved from some kind of Asian ape, maybe a bit like a gibbon. So he wanted to travel to Asia, and so he got himself into the army because he knew they'd send him to Indonesia, and that's how he ended up in the late 19th century on the island of Java. And in 1891 he started digging near the village of Trinil on the banks of the Solo River, and he started to find fossils. So he discovered the very first fossil of what we now know as Homo erectus, so an early species of human. He didn't call it that, he called it Pithecanthropus erectus, which means the upright ape man. And he found a skull, he found a skull cap of a skull that would have been about 1 litre in capacity, so a bit smaller than a modern human skull. Our skulls are about 1.4 litres in capacity. Mine's very average in that respect. Nina's might be a bit bigger. He found a molar tooth, he found a thigh bone, which was really important. That's what told him that this ape walked upright on 2 legs. And he collected lots of other evidence as well, including evidence of the kind of environment that these ape men, which became known as Java man, were living in. And years later then, researchers were able to return to his archive. He wrote about what he did, but he also had this physical archive of the objects that he dug up on Java. And a group of researchers returned to that archive a few years ago, a group of researchers led by Josephine Jordans from the VU, the Free University of Amsterdam. And what she found as they were looking through that archive is that there were many, many shells in that archive, and many of them were of a species which was a kind of an extinct freshwater mussel. And they looked like they'd been interfered with. So some of them were bashed in such a way that you detach the little muscle that holds the shell together. So they looked like they'd been bashed open, in other words, so that somebody could get at the flesh inside that muscle. That was interesting because it suggested that Java man was eating shellfish, and that's not something that we thought came along till a bit later in human evolution. So that's kind of interesting. And then they also found one of them which looked a bit like a scraper, so it seemed to have some wear on it, which suggested it had been used as a tool. So using shells as tools, that was quite interesting and novel as well. But then there was one shell which was just extraordinary, because when they analysed this one shell, and I have a 3D replica of it just here, they looked at it carefully, and I hope you can see that in this raking light. There's a zigzag pattern on this shell, and it looks very intentional. It looks like somebody has deliberately carved that into the shell. Now, we don't really know of any other animals that do such intentional mark making. Mark making like this seems to be something that nowadays is just something our own species does. Could it have happened since Eugène Dubois dug it up? Well, they investigated it, and they decided by analysing the scratches very carefully that they'd actually been made when the shell was still fresh, and this shell was 500,000 years old. So it looked as though those scratches really did go back to 500,000 years ago. Now, this is quite contentious because it's at least 300,000 years before anything else comes along that looks even remotely like art or mark making. But if it is what we think it is, if it is a very deliberate pattern that's being scratched onto this shell, this is the earliest evidence of mark making, possibly we could call it art, that is in existence. And what it tells us is that those people, those humans, they're humans but they're not modern humans, had that mental capability to do this, and they had the manual capability to carry it out as well. And then you think, why didn't it take off? Why didn't we see more art after that? It may simply have been that there just weren't enough people around to pick up the idea and to run with it, to get infected by that new idea of art. So it gives us the tantalising possibility that at least the capability for producing art goes back even earlier than our own species, goes back deep into human evolution, 500,000 years ago, to Homo erectus on the island of Java. Over to you, Nina.
Hello everybody, thank you Alice for starting us off on this adventure through art and history. That object you chose was extraordinary. The idea that humans were making marks, were leaving an impression of their creativity hundreds of thousands of years ago, is for me the best place to start this adventure. I'm going to move us forward many hundreds of thousands of years, but still stay in that period of dark, deep history. Now, I'm a medieval art historian usually, and I spend a lot of my time trying to convince other historians that it's worth looking back, say, 2,000 years for evidence. But this object I'm going to talk about takes us much further back in time, 40,000 years ago. It's known as the Lion Man of Holstenstein-Stadel, and it is the oldest discovered piece of figurative art ever made. It is not just important for being the first, it's also just an extraordinary artwork. So this predates the cave paintings of Lascaux, this predates the Venus of Willendorf, and it is so complete and realised that what it really leaves me feeling is, what other artworks haven't we discovered yet? Because by the time this was made 40,000 years ago, these are not just people scratching marks into stones. This is true artistic creativity. Let me show you it again. So it's carved out of a single mammoth's tusk. This is the object from 3 different angles. And what you can see is there is clearly the head of an animal. Now this is most probably a mountain lion. And certainly the shoulders and the paws, they have animalistic qualities to them. But as we come further down the creature, you can see there's actually a belly button that has been deliberately drilled into the figure. Now that suggests it's a human. So what we're looking at is a deliberate combination of an animal, a lion, with a human. Now, even when we think about some of the later cave paintings, there's a sense in which early humans, Homo sapiens, were trying to depict the world they saw. So they would depict the hunt, they would depict bison, creatures that they could see with their own eyes. And the creativity they realised in those exercises is extraordinary. You've got perspective, you've got all sorts of different tonality. But what I think is so extraordinary about the Lion Man is this is yet another creative and artistic leap. To take 2 separate creatures, a man and a lion, and to, in your imagination, combine them, that to me is an extraordinary moment of evolution for the human imagination. The place where the Lion Man was discovered, the cave, was a very curious place anyway. There's lots of legends surrounding it, and I've been there. It's very strange going deep into this cave to the very back part, which is where the Lion Man was discovered. Now I know Alice and I often cross swords over this. She likes to find sensible, rational, scientific explanations for things. And I tend to lean towards the idea of ritual and symbolism. And that is because I'm a medievalist. And when I look back to the medieval past, almost everything had a symbolic or a religious element to it. And I don't necessarily think that we can go back that far in time and say the Lion Man was ritualistic or symbolic, but there is something about this idea of transforming from man into lion or lion into man that connects with ancient shamanic rituals. The idea that you could, in a trance-like state, become more than human, have the power of that most predatory beast that was the biggest threat to humans, the lion, that you could assume that power. And just where it's found, the time and the space and the environment in which it's discovered, all of that again strikes me as a space that was just exploding with creativity. And if they're able to create art, to create these sorts of imaginative pieces, are they not able to try and ask those big questions that we've always been asking ourselves as humans? Where do we come from? What's the meaning of life? So there is perhaps a ritualistic element to this object. But that aside, the pure artistry of it is staggering. Have a look at some of the details. Can you see these marks on the arm of the lion man there? They are possibly scarifications, ritual sacrificial scars that have been carved into the arms. There's details, something that foxed academics for a long time with the lion man was the genitals. This little piece you can see hanging down, that was a fragment that was reconnected during one of the many puzzles that this object has been through. It was discovered on the eve of war in 1939, and then it lay hidden in a box in fragments until the 60s, when it was pieced together the first time. And then in this series of mysterious events, different bits of the lion man kept appearing. A little boy claimed to have found part of it while he was digging around in the cave in the 70s, and it was all put together afresh in 2013, and that's the form that we see it in today. It's an extraordinary object, and as I mentioned it, the environment in which it was found is extraordinary, because in this region around the Rhone Valley in southern Germany, at this point around 40,000, 35,000 years ago, there was an explosion of things that we associate with human creativity. So as well as art, we see the emergence of music. The oldest flutes have been discovered in these caves. They're either made of again, mammoth tusk, or they're made of bird bones that have been hollowed out. And I've heard people playing them. It's a eerie and wonderful, magical sound that really works in those cave spaces. It's extraordinary for me to think back that far, but to think of ancestors, humans, in these caves making music, carving away hour after hour after hour, conceiving of an artwork in their head and making it with their hands. That's exciting for me. Alice, what are you going to do next?
I see your lion man and I raise you as the Rice Bison. Now this Rice Bison isn't as old as the lion man. He comes from a site dating to around 20,000 years ago, a site I visited about 2 hours drive at least south of Moscow. I was there in 2013 talking to the archaeologist Sergei Lev, who led the excavations at Zaraisk, right at the bottom of the towers of the Kremlin, this medieval Kremlin in the centre of the town. But when they dug down around that, what they found was Ice Age remains dating back to between 22 and 16,000 years ago, and this bison belongs in that period of time. So this is around the peak of the last Ice Age. The Ice Age was at its chilliest 20,000 years ago. The ice sheets descended over Europe at that time, and at this point in Zaraisk, the landscape, which is temperate today and wooded, would have been tundra. So there were very few trees, very little timber. And what Sergei and his team found was that people were living in semi-subterranean houses, huts, that they dug down into the ground and they roofed them over using mammoth bones instead of timber for the structure. And they were also burning bones on fires as well because of the lack of wood. But they were using mammoth ivory for something else as well. They were carving it. As is the tradition, on the last day of the dig in 2001, Sergei stumbled across something amazing. he realised that what he was trailing away at was a piece of carved ivory. He found just the ear and the horn of what turned out to be an astonishing carved bison. He rang his superintendent in Moscow and got an extension on the dig, and they continued to excavate and lifted this absolutely exquisite carved bison. I've been lucky enough to hold that bison in my hands. The bison is about 20 centimetres long. It's just a beautiful work in observing nature. There were scratches along its neck to indicate a mane. It was just beautiful. And I talked to Sergei about what it was and what it meant, and he said it's a ritual object. It's been used in some kind of hunting ritual. It's been stabbed, it was pierced with holes, and it's been covered with red ochre representing blood. And I said to him, Sergei, do you think it could have been a toy? Now, I think when I suggested that to Sergei, he was a bit taken aback to think that I could possibly suggest that this beautiful object could have been a toy, could have been something that children played with. But I don't think that demeans the object at all. If you think about what toys are, they're about passing information on, they're about learning. We learn through playing very much. And those Ice Age children would have had to learn about all the animals in their environment, the animals that they would hunt as they grew up, the animals that would sustain them during those incredibly cold winters at the peak of the Ice Age. And I can imagine an Ice Age mum or dad sitting down and whittling away at that ivory evening after evening around the bone fire in those underground houses. And perhaps it's a birthday present, perhaps it's a present on the solstice, who knows? I think ultimately what we have to do is bear in mind all these different possible explanations for the objects and the finds that we see from the deep past, because reaching this far back into prehistory, we don't know what they are, and we don't have any documentary evidence to help us interpret them. So I think we have to keep our interpretations wide. Yes, the Rice Bison could be a ritual object, but equally it could easily be a toy. So I want to come back to the Lion Man and suggest that maybe the same thing is going on there. Perhaps we're looking at a ritual object, perhaps we're looking at something which had religious meaning, but perhaps we're looking at something whose meaning was more like this. So this is Quasi from the Octonauts. This is a cat-headed, human-like figure from my house. An archaeologist of the future might find that and see it as a deeply ritual object, and maybe I have a little shrine to Quasi and the Octonauts. So it might be deliciously mysterious on the one hand, but I think there might be something very, very familiar going on with these objects. So it may seem heretical. I would like to suggest that the Rice Bison may have been a toy. It may not have been ritually killed, as Sergei Lev suggested. It may have been killed in a play fight, perhaps with another child who had an ivory mammoth, who knows. And I would like to suggest that maybe that more ancient Lion Man of Ulm also gives us an insight into the Ice Age imagination and playfulness and children. So maybe this is what we're seeing, rather than ritual objects, religious objects. We're seeing Ice Age toys.
Well, Alice, I see your game and raise you the Lewis chess pieces. You set up the idea there of play, and I think it's something we very much underestimate in terms of objects from the past. We tend to look for deeply spiritual or symbolic or political motivations for why objects were made, but in many cases they were for play. And that's certainly the case when it comes to these. They are pieces that were intended to be played with on a chessboard. But interestingly, the Lewis chess pieces cross over into all these other areas of politics, ideology and power as well. So they're known as the Lewis chess pieces because they were found on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides, and they were discovered, a set of 78 pieces were discovered. 67 of them are now in the British Museum and 11 are in the National Museum in Edinburgh. And as as they are as a collection, they're not one complete set, but there are many pieces from a number of sets. So it's possible that they were buried intentionally by a merchant who was looking to sell them, possibly to someone very wealthy and influential on the Isle of Lewis, or possibly continuing on their journey to trade them. Now, the style of them is interesting. Have a look at that face. Oh, get it into focus. So this is one of the queen pieces. And in terms of the decoration, if I turn her around, you can see the back of the throne she's sitting on has got these spirals at the back. Stylistically, the nearest thing we find to this are pieces from Trondheim in Norway. And certainly Lewis seems to have been connected to that area. That was where their archbishop was based, for example. And what this makes us think about is a different way of conceiving the medieval world. These are 12th century pieces. So Vikings had been moving across these northern waters for hundreds of years at this stage. And we tend to think about the United Kingdoms looking south, looking down towards Europe. But for a long period, from the 8th century right through to the 13th, there was this northern empire that connected Norway, the Hebrides, right the way round to Ireland, where the Vikings had their power base in Dublin. So it's very possible that these pieces were intended to move along that route, but they end up buried in Lewis. What we see now is just the what was underneath paint. They would have been painted red or black to distinguish the two teams. And this was most likely made of walrus tusk, although some were made of whale teeth. So very precious raw materials if we compare walrus tusk to ivory. And that means that these are high status pieces. They're also high status because of the delicacy with which they're worked. Just look at the folds on the back of the Queen's veil there. They're incredibly highly worked, and they would have been, as I say, high status objects that belonged to someone very powerful and influential. Now, the game of chess has long been associated with elites, but particularly warrior elites, because on a board you can work out tactics to defeat your enemy. When do you move the knights forward? When do you use your poor peasants, your rooks, to do all the pawns to do all the hard work? And in the case of the Lewis chess pieces, it's the rooks, the castles, that are the most interesting. They're not, as we know them now, little turrets. They're in fact berserkers. Now, this word berserker, it comes from an idea that that Viking warriors would rush into battle wearing the skins of a bear berserker, and they would just use their bare hands to rip the enemy apart. They were the elite fighting force of Scandinavia, and so the fact that they're represented in the Lewis chess pieces, one of them is gnawing on the edge of his shield. He's so desperate to get into battle. That suggests, again, this northern connection, but it also puts us firmly on the idea of the battlefield and military tactics. The Queen is interesting though. Unlike the later, more modern queens on a chessboard, who actually are the most important pieces and can move everywhere, the Queen could only move one space diagonally. The Queen was subservient to the King in earlier medieval chessboards. And in that respect, it reflected medieval society more closely, of course, where women didn't have those sorts of rights. But I think what's so powerful about looking at her is she's got her hand resting on her face like this. She's contemplative. And again, if we read medieval documents on what the Queen's role was in court, it was to give wise counsel to the King, to really think and contemplate through the issues that affected the court, and to offer that sound advice. So she's got this pensive gaze that now I think looks a little bit comical, but at the time would have had, again, layers of meaning associated with it. Alice, over to you.
Well, I see your voyages, your maritime adventures, and your powerful woman, and I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball now. I'm going to take us from the Outer Hebrides around to the other side of the globe, to the Northern Territories of Australia, and back in time as well. A few years ago, I went on an amazing global adventure tracing ancient journeys that took our ancestors from Africa, some of our ancestors from Africa, to colonise the globe. So this expansion of the human population that took place in the Stone Age, in the Old Stone Age, the Paleolithic. And we can uncover those forgotten journeys, those forgotten migrations, using archaeology, looking at things like stone tools and the use of paint, for instance, but also fossils, so the fossil remains of our species, Homo sapiens, and also now as well we have DNA to help us tell that story. So I was tracing this human expansion all the way around the coasts of the Indian Ocean down to Australia, where we know that there was always a deep sea channel between the last Indonesian island and Australia. So there must have been a voyage to get to Australia all those thousands of years ago, even when it was the peak of an ice age and the sea levels were at their lowest. They still would have had to cross a vast deep sea channel. And when I went to Australia in search of this story of human origins in Australia, I knew that there was a site, or a couple of sites in the Northern Territories, which were quite controversial at the time. They found some lumps of what looked like ground down ochre, as though it had been ground and rubbed to release the pigment. And they came from sites, from rock shelter sites in the Northern Territories. There was one called Nawalabala and another one called Malacananya. And they were dated to around 60,000 years ago. Now that was quite controversial at the time. The oldest fossil remains are about 40,000 years old. And the genetics at the time suggested that the first Australians, the first Homo sapiens to enter Australia, had got there perhaps between 40 and 50,000 years ago. But we went out on a limb in the series, and I said, I think that Australians were here even earlier than that, if we trust the finds from those rock shelters. And I'm glad we did, because more than 10 years on, new finds have come to light. There's another rock shelter site with very, very well dated material. We have stone tools as well as ochre, again, this pigment that we don't know what they were using it for, whether people were painting themselves, painting their homes, painting their caves, whatever they were doing with it, but they're releasing this pigment from ochre. And we've got good dates that take us back to at least 65,000 years ago. And also now actually the genetics has come on in leaps and bounds, and that's the story that the genetics is telling us as well, based on not just DNA from living people, but also some ancient DNA too. So we know that there were humans in Australia 65, possibly even as early as 75,000 years ago, and we know that they came from the north down through those Indonesian islands and eventually got as far as Australia itself, and then colonised that whole huge island continent. Now, what I was also interested in doing when I travelled in search of these ancient stories and these scientific stories was also looking at local stories about origins as well. And there was an absolutely wonderful story from the Northern Territories in Australia that I want to tell you about now, because it also has an artistic element in it. So I travelled to an amazing artistic Aboriginal community in Australia in a place called Gunbalanya, and we had to be invited there to be able to go and meet the artists. And I met a lovely man called Wilfred Narrowridge and his cousin Gary Jorlam, and they took me on this journey into the landscape, and we travelled in a car and then got out into a boat because the billabongs were all flooded. It was the rainy season, and eventually got to a hill called Inyalak Hill, Fish Dreaming Hill. It was tied up with stories from the dream time. And Gary and Wilfred showed me some beautiful rock art. Now, it was undated, I don't know how old it was. They said it was very, very ancient indeed, and they still use that rock art to teach their children. They would take their children up into the hills, show them the art, and talk about the Dreamtime stories, the Dreamtime mythology. We looked at one panel which had lots of fish and a kangaroo and a human arm poking out of it. It was all quite naturalistic, although painted in this wonderful X-ray style. It was really gorgeous. And there were oranges and reds and blacks in the colours. And then we went right up onto the top of the hill and found this quite small image on rock face. And it was an image of a woman. I've got it in my book here. I don't know if you can see her just there. This woman is called Yingana, and Wilfred told me the story of Yingana, and I'm going to read his words because they're so wonderful. So he said, she came from the coast travelling. She's carrying lots and lots of dilly bags. Now, dilly bags are these traditional baskets, bucket-shaped baskets. So in the picture, Yingana is wearing a headband, and from that headband are lots and lots of straps, and on each of the straps is a dilly bag. So she had about 14 or so striped dilly bags hanging from her headband, and Wilfred told me that each one contained a baby. Once she came, she put down one baby and gave him a language and a skin name, a clan. Then she came to another place. The second one, she gave him a different clan, skin name, language. Then she kept travelling. The third one, she gave him a different language, different moiety. She kept travelling, putting down these babies, the ancestors of us. The story went on. Yingana was seeding Australia with its original people. And I said to Wilfred, I've been trying to trace the story of the colonisation of Australia, and we know from fossils and genes that the ancestors came from the north, perhaps across the sea. And that's what Wilfred said too. He said, yeah, I think this creation mother might have come from Makassar way, from Indonesia. So I was fascinated by that, but it probably wasn't the amazing coincidence it first seemed. Wilfred was an educated man. He knew the stories from his own ancestors. He knew these mythologies, these rich mythologies, and he saw no tension between those stories and the scientific story that was emerging. He brought the two together, and I thought that was wonderful and magical, and all those ancient journeys and those ancient stories woven together. And I like to think of Yingana with all her dilly bags and her babies in them, travelling around Australia and seeding the continent with the original Australians. So that's the end of my artistic forays into the deep past. We're not at Glastonbury this year. Hopefully we'll be back there next year. Wherever you are, I hope you're having a wonderful weekend. Stay safe, keep well, and it's over to you, Nina, for the final piece in this story.
Hi Alice, and hi everybody. We're coming to the end of our journey around the world, a history of art in 6 objects. And we've travelled up to the Orkneys, we've thought about Scandinavia, we've moved to Russia, Germany, Java, all the way over to Australia. Now I want to complete the circuit of the globe by going across the Pacific and ending up in Mexico. I had the amazing experience of filming a documentary on the Olmecs. Now, before I made that documentary, I knew that Mesoamerica, Middle America had an ancient history. I knew it went back beyond the Aztecs and the Incas, but I wasn't sure exactly what was before that. And of course it was the Olmecs. Now what's extraordinary is that the Olmecs were a fully fledged civilization. They had some extraordinary achievements. They are thought to have developed some of the earliest writing. They certainly had the earliest ball games, so they understood how to work rubber. And so we find footballs, this sort of form of ball game that was a little bit like chess, not just about pleasure and enjoyment and sport, but also about power and politics and the playing out of those things. So they are a very complex civilization. And they have major settlements with big sort of proto-pyramids made out of earth and stone at places like San Lorenzo and La Venta. But I want to go back even earlier, because what struck me about the Olmecs is they were doing what they were doing around the time the Great Pyramids were going up. So we know Olmec civilization started around 1400 BC. But the find I want to talk about, the last one I want to talk about, goes even earlier. It dates it possibly back to 1600 BC or even 2000 BC. And these are the wooden heads that were found at El Manati. Now I was honoured enough to meet the archaeologists that made that discovery, and it was in 1989. The site where it was found was a lake, And the reason that these objects survive is because there was anaerobic conditions under the water that had sealed in a whole layer of what appeared to be offerings to the lake. So there are these wooden heads I'm going to talk about, but there were also rubber balls and oddly the bones of infants and newborn children. So we do wonder about whether the Olmecs performed infant sacrifice, and these bones sort of tie in with some of the other art historical evidence. So for everything marvellous and wonderful and enlightened that a civilization like the Olmecs achieved, there's also often a dark side that we struggle to comprehend. But the El-Manatee heads I find to be one of the most extraordinary set of objects I've ever encountered. They are so ancient, but they're wood. And the idea that this wood, this material that so much over time must have been carved out of, built out of, it deteriorates across the archaeological record. To find wooden sculptures that are coming up to 4,000 years old is truly extraordinary. And what's remarkable about the heads is the level of individuality each one has. So Pop, the main archaeologist on the team, he's a wonderful person. He has named each of the heads after a member of the team that discovered them. And his particular head, they've all got this sort of shape to them, which could be because of the pressure that's been exerted on them while they've been under the water. But what we see in other Olmec sculptures is there may have been some sort of head shaping done, particularly from when babies were very young, that gives this elongated shape to the head that we see in other sculptures. The thing I find so fascinating is why they were there. Were they a memorial to people who had died? Were they offerings of idealised humans or gods even? As a collection, what they tell me is that humans have been trying to replicate the human face and have been trying to sort of make time capsules of themselves. We still do it today, and what a time to be alive at the moment. As I sign off, I want to thank Alice for this opportunity. I want to say, get us back to Glastonbury. We want to be with you in the fields, enjoying this next year. And in the meantime, just keep hope, keep positive, and keep supporting one another. Thank you so much for coming on this journey with us.